Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I take a look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. Up until now, my focus with this series has been exclusively on PC games, because that's what I'm more familiar with and what is easier to find and record. However, since this is the 10th one of these I've done, and because the game in question is 25 years old in a couple of months, I figured it was time to make an exception for one of the few console franchises that I got to play as a child, Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic's reputation has been an interesting thing to look at over the past few years. On one side, you have a rabid fan base who will crucify anyone who makes fun of the Sonic, if they can make their way off DeviantArt for 5 seconds. On the other side, you have the rest of us who have become somewhat jaded by how inconsistent the 3D releases have been. Initially, I was erring closer to the former, as there were very few games which I had actually played, and of those, I was more willing to forgive the flaws. I got through most of Sonic 2 and beat Sonic 3 and Knuckles multiple times, but apart from a couple of the mediocre 3D Sonic games and this abomination, I haven't really played much of the franchise. Because of this, I decided to start at the one which I'm surprised I haven't played until now, the one that started it all. This was the original game set to compete against Nintendo and by extension, Mario. This was the one that began what looked to be a glorious legacy. The question in my mind is, as someone who doesn't play a lot of platformers, whether or not it's worth looking at now. So without any further ado, let's dive into it. Since the gameplay is the most important aspect of most old school games, let's start there. As a platformer, your goal is to traverse dangerous terrain, avoid or beat down any enemies you come across, and get to the end in one piece. In order to get past some of these hazards, you're going to need to, as you would expect, jump. A lot. In order to take down enemies, Sonic has to curl into a ball, which he does automatically whenever he jumps, and can be done while running by hitting the down key or moving down on an analog stick. Besides just avoiding traps and taking down enemies whenever possible, there are a few tricks to keep you afloat when there's trouble, as a single hit is all it takes to make you kiss your life goodbye. As you play, you collect rings which are thrown from you if you take a hit, and if you're able to collect 100 of these, you get an extra life. It's unlikely you'll be able to pick all of them back up when you're hit, but it gives you some ability to recover from a mistake before trying again at whatever hit you. Some of these rings are tucked away in small computer monitors, while most of them are collectible as you move through a level. These monitors can also hold shields that protect against a single attack, and in rare cases give either temporary invincibility power-ups or extra lives. The main thing which Sonic is known for is his speed, as everyone will tell you that when it comes to the blue blur, you gotta go fast. However, while Sonic's speed may have been the tagline, the excellent level design is the unsung hero, making the fast moments work for a number of reasons. Since that this is an old game, you can't see very far in front of you, so unless you know what's coming, going fast might not always be the best idea, as you might run into the end of a level or something wanting to kill you. Whoa, okay, that could be bad. Step onto this. Okay. Whoa, okay. For a second I thought I was gonna lose it. Yeah. This is going on a bit. Now I see why these are short, and offer continues. Ow. No! Why would you do that? So mean! What? Are you freaking You are so scummy! Oh my gosh! Wow! There is a distinct difference between moving fast and moving carelessly, and the trick is figuring out that difference before you jump into a pit of death. As a result, the game can be much slower than you might expect. That might seem like a problem at first, but an issue that some modern Sonic games have is that because they're so focused on going fast, you lose perspective on just how quickly you're moving. Slower sections where you take your time simultaneously allow for more gameplay variety and helps give a perspective on how quickly you are actually moving, making those sections where you do move at blazing speed all the more intense. To help reinforce this, the game has one other trick up its sleeve, which again hinged on really good level design: multiple paths to the end. This might seem odd at first, but think about an old school Mario level. There are your pitfalls, your spikes, and your enemies to get past, but the levels themselves are often very one-dimensional. There's only one path to the end, and if you try and stray from it, then there's a hazard ready to put you back in line. With Sonic, if you manage to make an awesome jump, then there can be a secret pile of rings or extra pickups stashed away, or a completely different pathway separate from where you've been. Not only does this add more replayability, it also made getting defeated and sent all the way back to the start much more bearable. The version I got from Steam has the ability to save progress, but back when this game was released, save files really didn't exist. The most that you might have had were game codes that you had to tediously put in, but either they became very complicated or didn't completely preserve the progress you had made up to that point. Since Sonic didn't even have that, losing is made much easier to swallow because of the multiple paths. It gives a more compelling reason to explore and see if there is anything worth discovering that might help in the next run. In a game which can be beaten in an afternoon, this was a smart move. While I'm on a level design kick, it's also worth mentioning how two-dimensional the levels are, and before you spin that as an insult, let me explain. Going back to the Mario example, not only is the path the same all the time, it's also usually a straightforward path, literally. An old-school platformer back then was the art of moving right, and even in Sonic this is still somewhat the case. However, even when you had only one path to the end, there were plenty of times where I had to move in literally every direction in order to progress, which meant that the levels themselves became even more memorable as a result. I've been gushing over how solid the game is from a design standpoint, but if I'm honest with myself, it wasn't all rings and robot smashing goodness. The biggest issue I have is the same criticism I levy against most old games, and it comes down to what it does and doesn't tell you. That might seem odd at first, as the mechanics are easy to figure out, but as someone approaching this for the first time, knowing what is and isn't a pit of death can be a little too reliant on trial and error. Ordinarily I can tolerate trial and error, but when you have a limited number of lives and not necessarily enough skill to stockpile them, running into that point where you have to reckon with trial and error does make the game feel less fair. There are a lot of things that the game doesn't explain that you have to figure out on your own, such as how sensitive the hitboxes are for where you're jumping, the fact that you need to get bubbles to keep from drowning in water sections, the fact that shields don't stack, and the fact that nothing, be it a shield, rings, or invincibility pickup, will protect you from getting crushed, falling off the level, or drowning. Don't even get me started on the invulnerability window you get after taking a hit. I've had the game do some weird stuff to me when I was put between a wall and a sharp place.
Alright, so far so good. Although I could definitely use some air now.
Have you ever questioned where that
What?!
Physics!
That wasn't physics taking a day off, that was it dumping all over me.
Part of this surfaces in each level's little gameplay changes. The game is broken up into 6 zones, with 3 acts acting as levels for each. The first 2 have your standard goal of getting to the end in one piece, and the final ones have a small boss fight. Each zone has its own little thing that makes it just different enough to be fun and engaging. The boss fights are fairly simple, asking you to take down the evil Dr. Robotnik in person, who is the one that made all these robotic jerks that want a violent word with you. Hit him 8 times before he knocks you out, and you move on to the next zone. Each time you fight him, he has some new way to try and stop you, usually relying on the gameplay tricks that the zones levels throw at you. However, as mentioned earlier, the inability of this game to tell you things does become a problem here. In theory, you're supposed to hit him 8 times in order to beat him, except when you're not. In Labyrinth Zone, I thought that was what I was supposed to do and ended up being sent back to the beginning because I tried moving too quickly. In actuality, I just had to stay ahead of the rising water and avoid getting a spear to the face, and I was able to walk away without having to smack Robotnik about. That's without going into the amount of new stuff the game throws at you in the final zone, which did keep me on my toes as intended but was frustrating to figure out. With all of that said, the game would be worthless if the controls weren't tight, and often the lack of tight controls is another huge pet peeve when I'm looking at older games. However, I was pleasantly surprised at how responsive and reliable Sonic was to control. I decided to use a controller for this game, but given that a Sega Genesis controller didn't have an analog stick, it plays just fine on keyboard and mouse. The hitboxes also seem to be pretty reliable, though it does take some time to figure out what you can and cannot get away with. The only place where the controls don't feel as good as they should is in the bonus stages. If you're able to collect 50 rings before reaching the end of a normal level, you can enter this giant ring over here to enter a bonus stage. The background and stage itself is much more of a color vomit than the rest of the game, and the stage itself is constantly rotating, which means your goal of getting somewhere might not always work as intended. Your objective while in them is to collect rings, which in the process can earn you continues, allowing you to reset your progress at the beginning of your current zone and act, or an extra life if you can pick up enough of them. Your final goal is a Chaos Emerald, which is basically a fancy gem. Naturally, that's easier said than done, as because of how trippy the background looks and the constantly rotating stage, it gets very disorienting very quickly. The controls don't hold up as well here because a lot of the in-game speed and movement is based around momentum. If you want to get over a hill or through a loop-to-loop, then you need to get a running start. And since you physically can't get a running start in the bonus stages, that makes it a lot harder to progress unless you're either really good at timing out when the rotating stage will help you, or somehow stumble into the way forward. However, stumble into the wrong place and the stage will end without you earning a Chaos Emerald. They're not essential to completing the game, and in this game they provide no benefit, but that won't stop them from taunting you if you don't get every single one. Apart from that complaint, they do offer a welcome change of pace, and if you're able to get all of the rings required to access them, then you do get multiple chances to access said stages. Getting everything is a good challenge, and one that despite the game length probably won't be completed in an afternoon unless you're really good. As for me, I'm very glad I had my save button, as it would have taken me a lot longer to get right. With the controls and level design mostly on point, all that's needed is the proper visuals to match, and the art team did a really good job with that. I'm always surprised at just how much you can do with pixel art, as everything is sharp, sometimes literally, and looks really nice. The foreground and background are clearly defined, enemies are easily recognizable, and the hazards themselves are clearly marked as such. With the Steam version, there are also a couple of filters that will change the way the graphics look. I'm not experienced enough to tell the difference between the default and linear, though it seems to make the image more fuzzy. TV makes the game look like it's being played on an old CRT screen, and Enhance adds more detail to the sprites. I like that these are included, but I didn't end up using any of them for a variety of reasons. Linear made the game seem more fuzzy, the amount of lines in TV mode was overly distracting, and Enhance adds what I feel might be a little too much detail. What makes everything stand out and be recognizable is partially related to the simplicity of the sprites, and Enhance somewhat compromises that. I do still appreciate that they were included, however, as they do look nice when you're not actually having to play the game. The individual zones each have plenty to mark them out as unique beyond just the small gameplay variation. The aesthetic of each area looked really cool, with my favorite being the Spring Yard zone, if only for how colorful and bombastic it is. I really like the mix of springs and pinball-style obstacles, some of which are essential to time outright if you want to find every secret. The music is also well crafted, relying on chiptunes to create some really iconic stuff. I don't even have to tell you what some of them like Green Hill Zone sounds like without it getting stuck in someone's head, though I'm personally more fond of Starlight Zone's music. The boss fight music is the only part I found underwhelming, though my opinion of that is likely due to being spoiled by Sonic 3's boss music, especially the final boss track for that game. Overall, Sonic is a really well-designed game that managed to make the most out of the limitations of its day. Backed up by a cheerful art style, the tight controls and level design made this a fun, if occasionally frustrating game. That being said, it isn't without its problems, as there were times when more information should have been given, and there were times when it seemed that the game threw a middle finger at you. Also, since I don't tend to play or enjoy platformers, I prefer to play them in shorter sessions, which would have been next to impossible if I hadn't been able to save progress and walk away. Without that, I would have likely been much harsher toward the game, and that does bear mentioning if you still have the old equipment and game cartridge. After playing it though, I fully understand why people love this game, and while I don't fully share that love, I'm glad that I got to play it at last. If you need something to do for a weekend or afternoon, this would be a good game to look back on. If you don't have the original version, you can find a reliable copy over on Steam. However, before you pick this up, just bear in mind that the game doesn't always run the way you would expect. Whenever you take a hit with a huge number of rings on, and especially when you take a hit anywhere involving water, the speed of the game takes a nosedive. According to my recording software, it's staying at 60 frames per second, but the in-game speed seems to slow down a lot whenever it has to render a ton of rings falling off of Sonic. The water sections also seem more sluggish than you would expect despite the conditions you're in, to where I can't tell how much of it is a performance problem and how much is a matter of the water itself. These problems persisted even when I wasn't recording, so either way, just bear in mind that it can have a tendency to slow down when you lose a lot of rings. I cannot confirm whether this is an issue of the Steam version or if it was something endemic on release, but it definitely did cause some issues for me while I was playing. That's all I have for this video, thank you all for watching. Please consider liking and sharing this if you find it deserving, and keep an eye on this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. And now, after all this time, I can officially say I've done an old-school platformer for this series. Shame I can't do anything Nintendo-related without getting nuked from orbit. It would be fun to go back to the original Super Mario Bros. Well, might as well head back to my comfort zone with the next one. Until we meet again.